We are moving forward with the program. We have a particular part of the program that we're excited about because one of the things that the coalition is always thinking about is how do we measure the impact of what we're doing? We have great ideas. You all have good ideas. You're all trying to make change in your organizations, come together to make change. How do we know that we're really making a difference? We want to make sure as a coalition that we have some evidence for that. We're starting with evidence for the ways in which students respond to different situations, the sense that we need to provide them with care, the sense that we need to provide them with opportunities to exercise what they're learning in the classroom. But how do we know? And the realities, or the way in which we're addressing that, is really to think about data. How can we data, and actually, I'll say data because that's what the next session is really about, but we're also thinking, of course, beyond the data, are there stories, of course, that we need to start collecting to make sure that we're having the impact, the members of the coalition itself is having the impact that we really want it to. So, for this next session, we have Zach Karnowski and John Volin from the University of Maine to talk about what the coalition is doing in conjunction with Gallup, and in particular talking about the results of a survey that we have developed with them. It's very related to their alumni survey. We've been applying it to undergraduates, current undergraduates. We're seeing a strong correlation between alumni results, and they'll tell you more about this, and current student results. And we have developed that survey. We've applied it to a number of schools, members within the coalition. We're going to have Zach and John tell you about that. So let me introduce both of them a little bit more formally. Zach Karnowski is a senior education consultant at Gallup. He's a research consultant there and has contributed to more than 30 public sector survey research projects, primarily within Gallup's higher education practice since joining Gallup in 2019. In his role, Zach conducts quantitative data analysis, authors internal and public release reports to highlight study findings, and assists in survey instrument design. And he's helped us immensely in that. He also contributes to Gallup's national higher education research and has been a writer for Gallup News. Prior to joining Gallup, Zach served as Director of Student Programs at the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, where he was responsible for administering the organization's academic programming for university students and faculty. This included 25 annual conferences across the United States, internship programs, fellowships, and international study visits to the Arabian Peninsula. Zach received his bachelor's degree in political science from Northeastern University. And again, he's been working closely with the coalition over the last several years and has been immensely helpful to us in creating instruments to measure the aspects of students' undergraduate experience that contribute to lifelong well-being. John Volin is the Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost at the University of Maine. And prior to joining the University of Maine community in August 2020, he served as Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at the University of Connecticut with Tom Katsouleas, and where he was a professor of natural resources and the environment. He served a decade as department head and conducted research in ecosystems around the world, focusing on invasive species and restorative ecology. He has been awarded with more than $20 million in extramural funding for both research and foundational activities. He also directed UConn's Interdisciplinary Environmental Sciences program and co-founded the Eversource Energy Center. He also established the Natural Resources Conservation Academy at UConn, focused on conservation and land use planning education for high school students. His numerous awards include the Excellence in Research Award from UConn College of Agriculture, Health and Natural Resources, and a UConn Environmental Leadership Award. Prior to joining UConn, Dr. Volin was professor and chair of biological sciences and director of the environmental sciences program at Florida Atlantic University. He received his PhD in forestry from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he also did a postdoctoral fellowship. John is really part of the heart and soul of the coalition on the executive committee and very, very actively serves on that committee, even though he has many other responsibilities at the University of Maine. We are delighted to have his voice and insight in helping to guide the coalition's future. Zach and John.
It works.
So thanks, Keith. We were going to try to get back on time, but with those intros, we're just off.
No, unbelievable. Well, thank you, Keith, for the kind and lengthy introductions. Again, my name is Zach Ranowski. I'm a senior education researcher at Gallup. And as Keith mentioned, what I'm here to do today is share with you some of the research that we've been doing with the coalition to try to quantify the experiences that we all hope that our students are having as educators, but in many cases, as the data will demonstrate, aren't necessarily reaching every single student, which I think is our goal. So very briefly, I won't spend too much time on this, but just by way of grounding, the reason that the coalition came to Gallup and partnered with us and chose us as a research partner is because we had been partnering with Purdue University since 2014 to measure the experiences of bachelor's degree holders nationally. What are the experiences that they had while they were undergraduates that maybe were transformative to their lives, and what do their lives look like today in terms of their personal well-being, their employment and engagement in their jobs, and can we correlate those things to really figure out what is it that makes a transformational experience that predicts great lives after graduation? And through that research, we found that there were 6 things, aptly what we've called the big 6, that fall into 2 general categories. The first being student support, which, if you were to summarize it, is, do I feel cared about by the people at my university? Do my professors care about me as a person? Do they make me excited about what I'm learning? And do I have a mentor who encourages me to pursue my goals and dreams after graduation? There are also 3 experiential education items that more or less measure, are you applying what you learn in the classroom outside of it? Do you have an internship where you can apply what you're learning in the classroom? Are you working on semester-long projects? And are you involved in extracurricular activities? If you have all 6 of those experiences, that's highly predictive of your likelihood to be living a life of well-being and thriving after you graduate, and also to be highly engaged in the work that you are doing. And those 2 things themselves are interrelated, because if you have a great job that you love and you spend your day doing something that's filled with purpose, you're more likely to be thriving in your overall life. So that was in the context of undergraduate alumni. But Rick and Keith and John and Tom and many others had this hypothesis that, well, maybe we should be figuring out if this applies right now to currently enrolled students. If you're a student who feels cared about right now, if you have a mentor right now, are you more likely to be thriving in your life? And are you on a trajectory towards a great job in the future? And so we set out to adapt the Gallup Alumni Survey to currently enrolled students. And to this point, through 2 administrations in spring 2022 and spring 2023, we've surveyed over 8,000 currently enrolled students at coalition institutions. So when we talk through the data slides about X% of coalition students say why, this is from a really robust sample, and we feel good about the validity of those data. You're also going to see on some of those slides comparisons to the Gallup Alumni Survey. Just a quick note, that's 600 recent graduates from 2017 to 2021. Of course, there are some complications when you're comparing currently enrolled students to alumni. So to sort of reduce the gap that we would expect between those 2 groups, we did limit our comparisons to only those folks who are recent graduates within the last 5 years prior to survey design, analysis, and reporting. So before I get into that, I'm going to turn it over to John to talk a little bit about how Maine has integrated this research and really started to design some interventions around it.
Great, thank you, Zach. It's actually always hard to follow Zach. He's absolutely amazing. But after Wendy and the panel, we're good. So I wanted to share like a case study, if you will, a little bit of an example of how we're approaching this and how we've used not only the Gallup survey as kind of a baseline, but then how we are also doing an assessment. And you may have seen some of this last night. Holly White, who's a PhD student in her 4th year, starting her 4th year, presented some of the results of her dissertation work in the poster last night. Brian Olson is Executive Director of Student Success and Retention at the University of Maine, and he's a really key partner and leader in this effort. About a little over 3 years ago, we got a very large, I would call it a challenge grant for student success and retention, and we focused on 3 key initiatives. And one of those key initiatives that we started right away is something called research learning experiences. And the idea was that every first-year student should get an opportunity in their very first semester to come in and get an authentic research experience. This was something that most students, when they go, whether it's a liberal arts college, a big public, what have you, usually by their junior or senior year, they're getting that kind of experience. So we decided through this grant that we would create special courses where students across a diversity of disciplines, where students would actually get this experience from the beginning. And the only non-negotiable really in the beginning was I said, we need to have an immersion week, a bridge week, a week before classes start to really help start to build that research creative mindset, but more importantly, really help build that sense of belonging, that sense of community, what have you. Throughout this whole process, we have been doing an assessment throughout it, which is one of the key components to be in the Coalition for Transformational Education. As you can see on that picture there, they then, after that week of immersion, they go, and that's with partnership with Student Life, very close with Student Life. That's a key component. Then they actually go into this research learning experience course for the rest of that semester, where, as you can see, it's really around authentic problem solving. So we did this about 3 months before the start of the fall semester in 21. FATI already had their courses planned, what have you. We put out this request for proposals, and we got an amazing response. We had over 30 sections of brand new research learning courses developed across almost, except one college, almost every college. To get a close-up of some of these as an example, that first one you see there, Recycle and Redesign, is in performing arts. That's a performing arts research learning, creative activity, the print in 3D and explore offshore wind. That is through the Maine College of Engineering and Computing Science. Just to give you an idea, the two world's largest 3D printers are at the University of Maine, and about 1.5 years ago, they printed a 600-square-foot house. First time ever fully bio-based house was printed at the University of Maine. The Hunt for Viruses, as you can see there, that one has become specialized for majors only. And the one that you see on the far right is Learn the Business of Healthcare. That's actually an advanced RLE. These are for second year and beyond students in business to work with different health groups across, mostly in the local area, some across the state. So this is how it started. We started with 2 universities, the University of Maine, which is the land grant, space grant, sea grant university in Maine, and our regional campus, the University of Maine at Machias. That was the fall of 21, as I said. FATI did this at the start, like 3 months before. They already had their fall courses set up, and we had 10% of our incoming students actually do that research learning experience. This last fall, all 7 universities in the University of Maine system participated, over 1,000 students. Here at the University of Maine, we actually had 30% of our students after just 2 years of doing this, of our first year students entering. So you can see there in the fall of 21, that was 10% of our incoming class. 2 years later, it was 30% of our incoming class. We started these purposely as 1 credit, because Tom touched on this at the University of Connecticut. This started as a top-down initiative, right? We all know that those aren't going to sustain, over the long run. It's got to be bottom-up, top-down. It's got to be everything in between. And so we did it as a 1-credit course, and the faculty and the staff that have taught these courses over time have actually gotten, they've embraced it so much that 2/3 of our courses are 2 to 4 credits now. In that first semester, because they wanted more time every week with these students. We started off with that immersion week. We developed it with several faculty members across different disciplines and student life, and it was this generalized bridge week. Faculty, as time has gone on, a couple years later, they can choose that still, but the vast majority of them actually have their own tailored bridge week experiences that they now do with their students. And so, as I said, we are researching this throughout, and Holly is really leading this effort. We're using a bocce design, as you can see here. So that's the before and after comparison that you can see. And so we have RLE students there compared to students that are not taking RLEs. We do surveys at the beginning of faculty and students. We do it after the course. Holly is doing longitudinal work on this right now through time. And of course, we control for demographic differences, et cetera. So I'll turn it back over to you, Zach.
Awesome. Thanks, John. So that brings us to why I'm here, because John and all of you are doing the really hard work of implementing this on the ground at your universities. But if you've attended one of my previous performances at the residency that I'm kind of developing with the Coalition, you will have heard me say one of my favorite Peter Druckerisms, which is what gets measured gets managed. And so if you don't know where your students stand today, Do they feel cared about? Do they feel like they're integrating what they're learning into the classroom outside? You're not going to know whether these really important interventions, like what John just talked about at Maine, is having the desired effect if students are feeling more belonging, feeling more cared about, feeling like they're experiencing what they're learning in the classroom outside of it. So what we set to do was measure how many students in these coalition universities feel cared about, feel excited about what they're learning, have a mentor. And what you can see here is even when you stack this up against Gallup alumni survey results, and as a reminder, these are folks who already have their bachelor's degree, they've gone through an entire 4-year program, and so that to me is sort of the cap on this is the number of alumni who have had these experiences. We notice that coalition students are almost already on par with alumni, despite the fact that many of them are first-year or second-year students and still have 2 years to find that mentor, to find that professor who makes them excited. So this is really great, a great trajectory that we're on. One of the questions that I often get asked when I present these data as a follow-up is, well, what does it look like for a student to feel cared about? What does it look like to feel like you have a mentor? And anecdotally, I've heard things like, I felt cared about when my professor knew my name, when they knew something about me outside of the classroom or about my family. And I don't cease to exist once I walk outside of the lecture hall. I'm a whole person to this faculty member. But we also ask a follow-up question specifically about mentorship. And of those students who say, I do have a mentor at my school, we ask, well, what does that look like? What is this mentor giving you advice and guidance about? And at the top of this graph, you'll notice some of the things that you would probably expect to rise to the top. Advice about your career, advice about your academics. But the 3 below that are the ones that really stand out to me as what defines a mentor. And 2/3 of students who say they have a mentor say that mentor is advising them on their physical or mental health. Half of them say they're being advised on their personal life or relationships, and 1/3 of them are being advised on financial issues, which might be things like scholarships or financial aid or general concern and anxiety that they won't be able to afford college next semester. So yes, a mentor on campus does often look like what you would expect. Here are the classes you need to take to graduate. Here are the internships that I think would be really good for you. But it also looks like, again, investing in students as a person, advising them on being the whole student. So we also asked these 3 questions about experiential education, and this is where we start to see a slightly larger gap with alumni, which again is something I would expect because I don't know how many first-year students or even second-year students are engaging in internships, and many of them are still probably exploring the extracurriculars that really speak to them. So compared to alumni, I would expect to see the 15 to 25 percentage point gap that you see here. But one thing that was interesting, I mentioned we surveyed in 2022 and 2023. One of the hypotheses we had about why these numbers might have been a little bit lower than the alumni averages was because of the pandemic, and many internships were not available and extracurriculars didn't have the resources or maybe even the ability to meet on campus. And we might see a year later an additional few percentage point bump in these items. We didn't really see that year over year. So I don't think that this is necessarily a case of the pandemic effects. I think this is a case of not every student has the opportunity or ability. And we know there are barriers like finances for internships. I can't take an unpaid internship and go live in New York City. So there are real barriers here, but we know how impactful these experiences are, especially in terms of workplace engagement down the road. So if you put all 6 of those together and you ask the question, well, how many of these 6 experiences is the average CTE student having right now? Only about 2% of them say that they have had all 6 of them, that they feel cared about, excited, and they have a mentor, and they're doing all 3 of those experiential education activities. If you bring the bar down a little bit lower to maybe if you've had 4 or more of those, right around the 50% mark, it's still only about 17% of currently enrolled students who say, I am having these experiences. So as Tom mentioned earlier, I think we all think, we're doing this work. It's happening. Students are cared about. They're excited. They should be excited about what they're learning. But what we find when we look at the data is not every student is either having that experience or they're not recognizing it. So one of the other questions I often get asked is, well, many of these students, again, they're first years, they're second years, they have time. By the time they're seniors, they're going to have all of these experiences. And while there's a certain aspect of truth to that, where if you look linearly, for the most part, you do see organic growth from the number of Big Six experiences that a first-year student reports vis-a-vis fourth-year students, seniors. But it's not the case where by the time you get to your senior year, you have stumbled into all 6 of these experiences by happenstance. In fact, if you just look at the seniors who are currently enrolled, the average senior at Coalition Institutions reports having had only 2.5 of those Big Six experiences, which again means by definition that they either don't feel cared about, aren't excited about what they're learning, don't have a mentor, or haven't had some of these experiential education opportunities. So I always like to emphasize that this is not something that happens by accident. It does take intentionality. I think that's why everyone is here today, to learn a little bit more about what does that look like? How can we start having more of these students access these opportunities and really important experiences and doing it earlier on? And I think John has a few slides about what that's going to look like.
Yeah, that's great, Zach. Thank you. And so we have done here at the University of Maine, in 22 and 23, we ran the survey. So while we're doing this kind of very deep dive on the assessment work, we also use the survey really as a baseline for us. So we will probably maybe not do it next year, but maybe in a few more years. But for us, it's a baseline. And so what you can see here is where it was 17% for all the coalition members, and we were included in that. So you can see we're at 13%, so maybe we pulled that down a little bit with the 8 colleges and universities that did it. But our overall 13% of UMaine students had 4 or more of the big 6 experiences. And if we actually then take it and look at our juniors and seniors, you can see we pretty much end up where the rest of the coalition members are, about that 2.5 experiences of the 6, which in some way, when I saw the previous data and our data, kind of surprised me. I actually expected it to be higher overall. And I'll go into the first and to the second year numbers there. So the sophomore year numbers match the first year of the coalition. And so if we were able to, in the last year that we did the survey, we were able to take out our RLE students. We couldn't get that in the first year that we did the survey, but the second year working with Gallup, we were able to pull out the research learning experience students from those students that had not had the research learning experience. And what you can see on this is that those first year match what the other coalition members have, in their first year. And while unfortunately our research learning experience students were quite a bit lower. And when we dug into the data, as you can see the little star down there, the RLA students were more likely to indicate that their professors cared about them, and that they started to get very active in extracurricular activities, which sometimes takes a while for students to do. And so this was actually pretty encouraging.
Awesome. So this is sort of the raison d'etre, right? I mean, it's one thing to talk about. Inherently, it's good to feel cared about. It's good to feel like you have a mentor. But there is a reason why we're doing this. And again, it's because it predicts outcomes down the road for graduates. It's not just taking care of them while they're on your campuses. You are taking care of them and protecting them in some ways for their futures. And so one of the ways that Gallup measures this is what we call our Life Evaluation Index. If there are any social scientists out there that are familiar with the Cantrell scale, we ask the question on a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate your life today? And how would you rate your life in 5 years? How do you think it will look in 5 years? If you give your current life a 7 or higher, and you give what you think your life will be in 5 years an 8 or higher, you are what is considered thriving by Gallup. Just as an aside, we released Gallup in partnership with Oxford and a few other partners, the World Happiness Report earlier this week on Wednesday. And the big takeaway from that was that for the first time, the United States had fallen out of the top 20 in terms of happiness rankings of 143 countries. But the thing that was more concerning to me was, for the first time this year, we also segmented it by age. So we looked at what are the best countries to be happy in if you are older, and what are the best countries to be happy in if you're younger. I don't know, I've seen some head nods. Does anybody know where the United States ranks in happiness among the 30 and younger cohort out of 143 countries? 62. That's the appropriate response. It's trailing countries like Honduras, Kosovo, countries where there is active conflict going on. Our 30-year-olds are less happy than youth in those countries. And so obviously there's work to be done here. We know one of the interventions to increase happiness and improve it is through education. For the most part, if you have a bachelor's degree, you are predicted to be more happy than someone who does not have a bachelor's degree. But if you look even within coalition students and alumni, they look more or less the same. About half of currently enrolled students and alumni are categorized as thriving in their current life. But I don't like to bring problems without solutions. And so if you look over on the right-hand side of that slide, you will see that the more Big Six experiences that currently enrolled students report, the more likely they are to be thriving. Among the limited cohort, the 2% who say they've had all 6 of those big 6 experiences, 85% of them say that they are thriving in their lives. So we have the tools, we know how to work it, and we just need to start putting it into action. Now, I also see President Spencer is here, and Gallup has previously done work with Bates around the effects of purpose and how that affects your lifelong well-being. And we know, if I could borrow from Orwell, all aspects of well-being are important. Some are more important than others. And purpose is one of those measures. If you are thriving in your life and in your job, you are much more likely to be thriving in your social connections, in your finances, in your community, et cetera. So we have a really specific focus on purpose with the coalition. And so for the first time in 2023, we started asking questions about purpose. Do you like what you do every day? Do you learn or do something interesting every day? And if you look at how coalition students answered those questions, it's between 56 and 61% of students who agree, I like what I do every day and I learn or do something interesting every day, which I think for a student on a campus is a little bit of a red flag. And more concerningly, we know that this is important to them. If you look on the right, we ask, how important is it to you to derive a sense of purpose from your future work? 90% of students say it is either very or somewhat important to me that someday I go into a job that is meaningful to me. And so if they're right now not learning anything in the classroom that feels purposeful or interesting or meaningful, the likelihood of them graduating and finding a job that fulfills that purpose is somewhat lower. And here is just, again, a demonstration of the effect of the big 6 on purpose well-being specifically. Again, we know that these things are correlated. Higher purpose well-being leads to higher overall life evaluations, and the big 6 affects both of those things independently and in congruence with one another. The last set of slides that I'll talk about here talk a little bit about belonging and well-being. And I know Dr. Blake mentioned this earlier about the importance of getting students not just to feel well and to be happy, but to feel like their institution has a vested interest in that and that their institution is doing things to make sure that they are well and happy. And so if you look at the percentage of coalition students who said, my institution cares about my overall well-being, only about a third of them, 37%, either agree or strongly agree that their institution cares about their overall well-being. We also do some national work at Gallup, not with the coalition, but just nationally enrolled students. And without getting too nerdy into the regression, I looked at what are the highest predictors on this national survey that we did of feeling like your degree was worth the cost and that you would recommend your university to others and recommend getting a bachelor's degree at all. And do you know what rose to the top? The item that went above career outcomes, above dollars and cents, loans taken out. It's an item to the effect of, when my institution makes decisions that affect students, I trust that my institution has students' best interests in mind. That is more important than dollars, cents, career outcomes to a student. And so I know Rick hammers all the time, as he should, this is partly to transform lives and make sure that students are living thriving lives after they graduate. It's also part of restoring trust in education as an institution. And we know that institutions, by and large, are declining in terms of the confidence that adults have in them. Higher education is part of that. It has plummeted since 2015 in terms of the percentage of adults who say they have quite a lot or some confidence in higher education as an institution. This is one of the ways that we can start restoring that confidence when we have students that say, when I was at my university, I felt like I was the only thing that mattered to them. They were so invested in me, and I can't imagine a world when I didn't attend that institution. So I'll turn it back over to John.
So I love doing this with Zach because every time we do it, I learn so much. It's amazing. I'm like, that's really great information. This is getting back a little bit to our data on the research learning experience. And I want to stress, I'm showing one big intervention that we do. But as we heard yesterday, there's a diversity of interventions that every university is doing and needs to do. So this is just one. And so far, the results are quite positive. So those, when we looking at relationship between RLE participation and growth and a sense of belonging measures. The belonging measures that we're looking at for retention are on the left-hand side there. You see, like, do they feel that they belong at their university in that course that they're taking? How's the morale and the reflection at the end of that research learning experience? And as you can see there, in fact, in the survey data and the data that we're taking, you can see, in fact, that the RLE students have showed higher growth compared to their peers And this, again, is controlled for demographic differences in their sense of belonging, both at the university, in the course, their morale, their reflection, and they also start to get a research mindset. They significantly have a higher research mindset at the end of the very first semester. So in some ways, it's like a democratization of honors programs, if you think about it. Because how many students in their very first semester get to do an authentic research experience or a creative activity? So that's really wonderful. I'm going to just plant this here. So maybe Holly, next year, you can give a talk on your longitudinal work. But she's doing a lot more work in the long run to see how, in fact, these relationships will come out. I think this may be one of my last. This is interesting. This is from the survey data. These are the hourly benefits that the students, when they were surveyed, felt. And so the first four, I should say, when you see learning outside the box, learning research skills, help me explore a field or discipline, about a third of the students said that. And that was great. I mean, it's their very first semester. But look at the ones that were actually higher. The ones that were higher is having a support system with a faculty member, having a support system with your peers, acclimating to campus during that immersion week, and making friends during that immersion week. And in fact, we have them do TikTok videos now, kind of at the start of their immersion week and then at the end of their immersion week. And what do you think it's about? I mean, they're all nervous in their very first day, and 5 days later, they're like, I found friends, I mean, it's really building that sense of community, that sense of belonging, and you can see that's how it's tied into. And in fact, our RLA students that feel supported, or very strongly supported by their classmates, is 68% compared to 45% of those that did not take an RLE. So pretty encouraging results there. Thanks.
And I'll just close out here on career prep. And I know we've already talked a little bit about purpose. And for most people, whether you like what you do every day and whether you learn something interesting every day is pretty closely tied to your career. But there are some aspects of it that are really worth calling out. And one of the stats that I like to use is from our CEO, John Clifton's book, Blind Spot, which is all about the rise of unhappiness and how leaders across the world missed it. And one of the keys to unhappiness and rising unhappiness has to do with how much you like your job. So if you look at those green bars on the left, you'll notice that if you have a great job that you love and feels really purposeful to you, you are far more likely than everyone else to say that you smiled and laughed a lot yesterday, that you experienced enjoyment yesterday, that you learned something interesting. And conversely, you're much less likely to say that you were angry, sad, or stressed out than everybody else. So this is something that sort of carries. The thing that always stands out to me is the blue and pink bars over on the right of each of those clusters, which are basically demonstrating that it is worse for your daily affect, both positive and negative, to have a miserable job than it is to have no job at all. If you have a bad job that you hate, you would be better off in terms of your happiness and well-being being unemployed, which is pretty stark. And so that speaks to the importance, one, of having a job that students are really engaged in. But if you want to hear from the students yourselves, they tell us, and they tell us often in a variety of ways, that when we ask, why did you pursue a bachelor's degree? What was the main reason? Without fail, career does rise to the top. So while things like well-being, trust, feeling like you belong at your institution while you're there are highly important, and in some cases more important than your career, students do have a reason for coming to college, and overwhelmingly it is to get that good or great job. So when we asked Coalition students about how well they felt their respective institutions were preparing them for life outside of college, to have the skills and knowledge that they need to succeed in the workplace, about half of them say that they're feeling well prepared for life outside of college. If you ask them specifically about the workplace, we're doing a little bit better. About 2/3 of students agree that they're going to have the skills and knowledge that they need to succeed in the workplace, and about 75% think that the major that they're currently enrolled in will lead to a good job. But I did want to highlight that just with the Big Six as a whole, this is not a metric that increases organically over time, where all of the Coalition students show up as wide-eyed first years and they don't know how they're going to learn everything they need to learn over the next 4 years to succeed in the workplace. But by the time they get to their senior year, they do, and they feel great and they're ready to take on the world. In fact, it's probably a statistical wash, but in absolute terms, juniors and seniors are actually less likely to feel like their institution is preparing them well for life outside of college. So this is not a case, again, where they just take the coursework that they need and that gets them everything. In fact, they're slightly less likely to feel prepared by the time they get to their senior year. Some of that might have to do with looking over the precipice and wondering and being anxious about whether you're going to make it. But in any case, students are not organically feeling more prepared for post-graduation life. But again, stop me if you've heard this before, the more Big Six experiences that a student reports, they are almost linearly more likely to say that they feel well prepared for their futures after college. So hopefully I've sort of talked about and highlighted the reason why we think these are important, not just intrinsically, but for those really important post-graduation outcomes. A couple of other slides that on diversity that we are starting to build out the way that we measure this as part of the way we talk about belonging on coalition campuses, and whether students feel like they have a diversity of thought in the classroom. I know Indiana just passed a bill a couple of days ago that makes this particularly relevant. So when we ask students at the coalition whether their coursework has encouraged them to look into a diversity of viewpoints, whether their professors are promoting a diversity of viewpoints, about 60% of them say that their professors have exposed them to a variety of viewpoints. They're less likely to say that they're comfortable sharing their opinions on campus, but I think a lot of that has to do with, and we've heard this qualitatively, it's not the environment itself, it's just a personal aversion to wanting to share some of these sensitive topics around their peers. What I don't have on the slide, but that we do have in the data, is you might expect there to be a wide partisan gap on this, where conservative students feel less likely expressing their opinions on a diversity of viewpoints. We don't actually see that. We see general parity based on partisan ideology among students, where liberal students and conservative students and independent students feel about as comfortable expressing themselves as everyone else from a statistical standpoint. We also ask students about, and this again plays into belonging, whether you feel that your institution is a good place for students who are members of racial or ethnic minorities, and whether it is a good place or not a good place for students who identify as LGBT. You will see here that generally speaking, Black students and to a certain extent Hispanic students are a little bit less likely than their peers to say that their institution is a good place or not a good place for students who look like them and have similar experiences to them. This is something that we don't have a trend for yet. The first time that we asked it was 2023, but this is another one of those modules that we're adding into the survey to get a better measurement of, do students of color or LGBT students not feel cared about because they feel like their institution isn't supportive of students who come from communities like theirs? We are trying to build out around not only the Big Six, but the driving forces behind the Big Six. What does it look like to be cared about, to have a mentor? Do you have faculty members who look like you, who come from places that you come from? And does that drive the Big Six in the way that we hope it will? So with that, Keith can correct me if I'm wrong, but I hope we've left a few minutes for questions. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, we definitely have some time for questions, so if people would like to hear more about the analysis, the data, I think we have one over there. Thank you, Ellen.
You may have said this, and I may have been looking at my phone or something.
You'd be forgiven.
At least you're honest.
It was very good, thank you. Of the Big Six, is there any sort of hierarchy of the ones that are most important in any ascending or descending order?
There is probably, in fact, there is statistically an answer to this. All of them, and I don't know if I can go back with this, I think I probably can. There are varying odds ratios of, if you have care over mentorship, what's the differential on likelihood that you're going to be thriving in your well-being? I would say in general, though, no. All of them have independent and additive benefits. So just because you feel cared about, it doesn't supplant mentorship and vice versa. So all of them have independent effects. Gosh, these odds ratios are way back here. But you can see, right, most of those additive or independent effects are somewhere in a similar range. You are, if you have each of these, if you strongly agree with the student support items and with the experiential learning items, you're bordering on twice as likely in your odds of being engaged at work, and somewhere between 1.2 and 1.4 times the odds of being thriving in your overall life evaluation. So you can see it's not a big gradient. All of these are about equally important. They are interrelated, but they do also have their own independent effects.
Hi, I'm over here. I was just wondering, I think one of the things that we struggle with is the ever so slight variations in the definitions of our terms. Here we're talking about well-being. You are trying to measure thriving. Yesterday we talked a lot about flourishing. Would you say that, just for the sake of this question, well-being, flourishing, and thriving, or even just flourishing and thriving, have similar definitions? Because I think we're all trying to measure something slightly different.
It's a great question, and you've heard from much more experienced and learned happiness and flourishing researchers than I am. But I do know enough to play one on TV very briefly. And what I would say is there are many ways to measure thriving. In fact, if you ask people about, are you happy and thriving in your life? If you ask it on a life evaluation basis, on a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate your life today? The Scandinavian countries often rise to the top. Finland is at the top of our happiness index. You tend to see Denmark and Iceland and Norway rise to the top. But if you ask it slightly differently about positive affect, did you laugh a lot less yesterday? Did you feel a lot of love yesterday? It's actually the Latin American countries that tend to rise to the top. So it really does depend on the way you ask the question. They are all slightly different constructs. So what we're measuring here is specifically what we at Gallup call thriving in terms of your life evaluation. But we do know that there are positive impacts of these things on all of those. I did briefly talk about the impact of jobs on your positive affect, which is slightly different from measuring life evaluation, but they have the same positive direction. So I would say by doing all of these, they might not have perfectly equal effects on flourishing versus thriving versus smiling or laughing a lot the prior day, but they are all going to drive things in the same positive direction. It's a great question, though. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much. Such great data from both of you. My question is about those students that have 4 or 6, big 6. Who are they? Are they the privileged students? Do we have Pell students in there? What do we know about them?
That is a terrific question. We do have it. I don't have it on these slides, so I don't want to speak out of turn in terms of the data. But what we do know is that it often looks different from a substantive standpoint of what does it look like to feel cared about, what does it look like to feel mentored, based on the students' demographic profiles. So, for example, first-generation students are often much more reliant on the infrastructure of a university. So feeling like my university cares about my well-being for a first-generation student might look like I don't get the runaround when I go to the financial aid office and someone can answer my question, versus maybe a student who's not first generation and relies more on a parent who went to college to answer those questions. So I think the way that you implement it and operationalize it might look different. I would say we don't see differential effects in terms of does this only work for privileged students or underprivileged students. I will pull these data. We have demographics and we collect them in the survey on first generation status, race, ethnicity, income, et cetera. We would definitely be able to get back to you on those data for sure. Thank you for the great question.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. Well, good morning. Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank you for sharing these insights. I come from overseas, and this survey has been particularly very helpful in guiding a lot of the conversations we have on our campus. For the past 2 days, I had some colleagues here asking me, why do you come all the way from Morocco? What are you doing here in the US? And I hope this answers it. We have similar challenges. And this survey in particular has been very, very insightful in helping us with the discussion. Now, and I have an anecdote about surveys because we recently hired, for the past 3 years, we've been expanding campus. There's been a lot of construction noise, and our students have been complaining about that. So we hired an external surveying institution to just test satisfaction. And there were 2 interesting results. Number one, it seemed like a lot of students are not happy, are not satisfied with the services due to expansion. However, the majority of students, when asked, would you leave the institution, most of them would say, no, I don't want to leave this institution. I like it. So the person commented, you're stuck with a very unhappy customer. Right?
That's great.
So as I was, for some reason I remembered that. A question to you, Zach, seeing as you're from Gallup. Our campus has 4,000 students, right? We always struggle to get good survey results, partially because you're surveying a very small number of students, and it's very hard. How do you have any practical tips for us, on avoiding survey fatigue and actually collecting meaningful, results from surveys? Thank you.
Well, that question fills my heart up. Thank you for asking that. And Ramadan Kareem, if you're observing. I did want to hit on your question because it brought up, your anecdote is brilliant. And I was in a meeting with some colleagues and partners that we work with, and there was someone in the room, we were talking about the value of college and sort of the dichotomy between declining trust and declining happiness and confidence in higher education as an institution, but we don't see the corresponding decline in enrollment. And more or less what I responded was, well, they're customers that don't have an alternative for the most part. You know, if there was an option to get an industry certification or some other credential that would let students achieve the goal of getting a good job by and large, I think many of them would take it. So you're playing a little bit with fire, and depending on the fact that there are, in many cases, no other alternatives for getting the outcome that you want, except for a product that you're not particularly happy with. To your question about survey fatigue, it's a great one. I'd love to actually tap into John, because he's the one who deals with many other surveys beyond just mine. But I would say communicating the reason behind the survey is critical. If it just feels like another box checking activity of you want feedback because someone in the provost's office has ordained it to be so, students can tell, they can feel that. If you tell them the reason we're doing this is because we want to increase your well-being on campus, we want to make sure that you are leading lives of thriving. And more importantly, after you collect the results, the worst thing that you can do with data is collect it and not do anything with it. So if you conduct a survey and students wonder, did anybody listen to this? Did anybody take this into account? Have any changes been made? They're not going to take the next one. You usually have them on the first one. So it's critically important from my perspective that when you collect data, you are responsible for doing something with it and telling students what it looks like and telling them the objectives of it. And John, I know that you're really experienced in this.
So yeah, thank you, Zach. And it depends, it is a great question, and we are always balancing that. We get requests all the time to do surveys. During the pandemic, we would do these, to your point about responding, we would do these flash surveys that were short, got wonderful response, but we acted on the results within a week. Mm-hmm. And if we couldn't act on something, we let them know why we couldn't do it. The first time we ran the survey with Gallup, because of the way the partnership with Gallup at the time, we could not the emails wouldn't come from us, and so it came from Gallup, and so it was very hard to do, a really great response rate. The second time, it didn't go up that much, but we worked very closely with Student Life, which has probably a stronger trust, relationship with students than upper administration. And doing that, helped bolster it. Toward the end, the last run that Gallup did with us, and not University of Maine, we ran a little bit earlier in the spring of 23, but the partners that ran a little bit later, they were able to incentivize the surveys. We weren't able to do that early on, but now, developing this relationship, they could incentivize it. And by incentivizing, like gift cards, what have you, that type of thing, it actually bolstered, the ability to go up. But you're right, it's very hard to get students in particular to respond right now. So I think we are like 12%, 15%. So, not as robust, but we can tie our particular research with Holly's research, where it's robust because you have a dedicated student that goes to the classroom, that follows up with the students, et cetera. So the combination is really a nice. And so if you're wondering why Brian and Holly left, it wasn't because they were disappointed with me. They had to make a plane. I'm just saying. Anyway.
And then last thing I would say, because it spurred such a good point, I'm going to break some news to you all. Higher education is siloed, and you have organizations within an institution that are all running their own little fiefdoms and running their own little surveys, and the students are getting all of them. And so if institutional research is running a survey and Student Life is running a survey and we're running a survey, a student's going to say, didn't I just answer this survey? And none of us are going to know that the questions have been asked. So one of the strategies that I have seen be very successful is sort of centralizing, or at least having a central repository where before you send a survey, you ask, have we asked this before and have we asked it recently?
Yep.
Zach and John, thank you for information. The question I have is, do you think there's any underreporting from question number 2 by the definition of professor, as opposed to others who students think of as teachers? They think they learn things from, but yet in several universities, it's just this notion that if a professor's not teaching it, it's not learning or it's not value. And I think that runs contrary to how a lot of students see their learning experience.
Yeah, it's a good question. We did cognitively test all of these items when we drafted the survey back in 2014. And so Brandon Bastide, who was at the time our director of education, I'm sure would have gone through, it predates me, I was in my senior year at Northeastern at the time. But I do feel confident that students understand the spirit of the question, that it doesn't necessarily have to be a full professor, it could be an adjunct, it could be a lecturer. It also is one of the items for which we see the highest levels of agreement. Usually we see it towards 80 or 90% of students who agree that the professor makes them feel excited. So I do feel pretty confident that students understand what we're asking when we ask it that way. Good question. That I actually, again, now I'm speaking off the cuff. But I think there probably would be some gaps if it's a coach versus a professor. So they may be excited about what they're learning somewhere else on campus. Of course, we haven't measured that construct quite as well. We do know from a mentorship standpoint, you'll notice that it's not I had a professor who encouraged me to pursue my goals and dreams. That's specifically about mentorship. What we have found in our research is that it doesn't really matter who that mentor is. It could be a coach, it could be a faculty member, it could be an advisor, a counselor, et cetera. It just matters that you have the mentor. It doesn't really matter who it is.
Yeah, that actually, I think your data shows that for the mentor, 75% of the time, roughly, is a faculty member. But then it can be a coach, even a family member, for the other 25%.
Yeah, I was going to piggyback on the first question about the big six experiences, whether they're purely additive or is there a compounding effect, et cetera. As a layperson with some experience in other enrichment programs, such as the high impact practices or the Grand Challenge Scholars Program, for example, et cetera, I think there is some evidence to show that if you have 2 versus 3, it's not just additive; it's a compounding effect, and it kind of is an exponential kind of a curve that you plot if you have 1 experience or 2 or 3 or and 4. So, but you said it's mostly linear. So I was just wondering, and you also said they're interrelated. So the kind of can be linear and interrelated at the same time. That's what, as a layperson, I'm asking this question.
Yeah, that's me being a little bit clumsy with language, probably. When I say linear, if you were to look at, and I'm trying to pull up one example, when you look at the relationship between, let's just use thriving as the first example, you do tend to see it's not just you peak and plateau. If you have at least 3 of these experiences, you've sort of tapped out the potential for increasing the well-being of a student. Getting them from 3 to 4 is beneficial. Getting them from 4 to 5 is beneficial. It's not perfectly linear, but you can see each additional experience that a student has is additive in their likelihood to be thriving. And that's even true at the lower levels, right? So we say that 2.5 is the average for the average senior. If you can get that from 2.5 to 3.5, it wouldn't get you to 85% thriving, but it would get you maybe from 52% thriving to 59% thriving. And so we don't see any evidence that there's an upper limit on at least the big 6. Maybe we need to, if we get to 6, we should find a 7th and an 8th and keep going until we get to 100% thriving. But we don't see any evidence that the benefits plateau at any point on that big 6 scale.
Great. I think we're going to have to cut the conversation and the questions at this point just to move on so we can get to the finish line and get to lunch, which is awaiting us very soon.
Don't let me be the barrier to that.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you, John. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.